Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. The Bible tells one big story of redemption, and we want to spend 5 minutes every day journeying through the Bible from start to finish and exploring how all of it points to Jesus.
Hi friends, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Shelby Turner. I'm one of your hosts for this podcast, and today we are going to talk about Acts 22 through 24. Yesterday, we left off on a real cliffhanger. Paul was being attacked and threatened death by a mob when all of a sudden a Roman soldier stepped in to calm the chaos. Paul then asked the Roman soldier if he could address the crowd that's risen up against him, and the soldier permits him to do so. Today, we're going to talk about what he said. So when Paul starts speaking, he actually is speaking in the Hebrew language. And this is significant because it is the native language of the Jewish crowd who was threatening him. And he's doing this on purpose. He wants them to know that he too was once like them. He was a Pharisee who persecuted Christians ruthlessly. And he is going to try to convince them to follow Jesus by sharing his Jewish heritage and his conversion story to Christianity. He starts by describing his credentials as a Pharisee, and he says that he was taught of Gamaliel. And while that name might not be significant to us, Gamaliel was a really big deal in that time. He was one of the top rabbis, and to be taught by him was extremely prestigious and highly respected. Paul continues to talk then about his conversion, but the crowd interrupts him when he talks about how the gospel of Jesus is for Gentiles as well as for Jews. They're in a total uproar at this point. But again, the Roman soldiers protect Paul from the crowd. Because under Roman law, and because Paul was a citizen of Rome, there could not be a flogging without a proper hearing. This seems like a devastating end to what was going to be an amazing gospel speech. Paul was hoping to convince and maybe even convert some of these Jewish leaders, but now they've only been further enraged against him. The Roman soldier, he wants to figure out why Paul is in so much trouble with the Jewish leaders. So the next day, he convenes a meeting with the high priest, the Jewish council, and Paul to try and sort this all out. In chapter 23, we see the details of this meeting, and it might be a good time to stop here and explain why the high priest, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees are so upset with Paul. So all throughout the Old Testament, God, through the 10 Commandments and through the prophets, told his people not to worship other gods other than him. But often the Israelites did exactly that. All over the place in the Old Testament, we see them building high places, Asherah poles, temples of Baal, and more. The Israelite people adopted many of the cultural religious beliefs of people who lived nearby them. The high priests and the leaders, they want to prevent this from happening again, and they think that Paul is guilty of this. They did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They thought Paul was bringing in another outside religion. So we can see where they're coming from, yet we also know that they are sadly mistaken. At the end of the meeting, Paul pits the Pharisee leaders against the Sadducee leaders. The meeting gets really out of control, but some of the Pharisees even begin to think that Paul could be innocent. We then learn about a plot to kill Paul. Miraculously, it was overheard by Paul's nephew, and the Roman soldier foils the plan. He sends Paul under the cover of night and with lots of protection to Caesarea. And the reason he's sending him there is because he wants the governor, Felix, to decide what to do with Paul. In chapter 24, the high priests and their spokesperson, who was probably a lawyer familiar with Roman law, gave their testimonies against Paul before Governor Felix. They accused Paul of stirring up riots, of profaning the temple by preaching what they think is the false message of Jesus there, and of being a Christian ringleader. Paul denies the first two things, but he gladly admits that he is a leader of Christians. Ultimately, Felix denies to make a decision about Paul, and he keeps Paul in a sort of loose house arrest. Paul tries to witness to Felix about Christ, but Felix was afraid of the message. He did decide to keep Paul in prison, though, because he hoped that someone would offer a bribe or money in exchange for Paul's freedom. At this point, Paul was in prison for 2 years, unjustly, and there was no one willing to either condemn or acquit him. At the very end of this chapter, Felix is succeeded by another governor, Festus, and we'll see soon what Festus decides to do with Paul. So, what can we take away from today's passage? A couple of things. Jesus told his disciples they would be hated because of his name, and Paul is experiencing this. However, Jesus also said, and you can check this out for yourself in Matthew 10:22, that even when we are hated because we profess Jesus, we should endure to the end because we will be saved. When we experience backlash because we profess Christ, then we should shift our focus not to what we see now, which is probably the pain of people's hatred towards us, but what will be, which is eternity with Christ. Thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to follow along on our Instagram pages at Daily Grace Podcast and at The Daily Grace Co. and check out our website, thedailygraceco.com, for all kinds of resources to help you dive deeper into God's Word. Thank you so much, and we look forward to chatting with you again tomorrow.